Feeling. Sorry, I can't read. Several announcements. First, I think we should give a rising vote of thanks to Merritt Jones and his kitchen committee for this morning. Merritt? We have our own special wonderful. Two announcements. On February 24, which will be our next communion breakfast, John Scott of Time Magazine will be our guest speaker. Shrove Tuesday on February 26th, a number of the men are putting on the pancake supper, which, as you know, was such a success last year. And this is particularly a family affair, and bring your children and so on. I believe those are all the announcements. Oh, I did have one. Yes, certainly.
There'll be I guess Bob should actually announce that there'll be a skating party. It's the 7th, isn't it, Bob, this month? Or February, rather? What's up, Friday? Pardon? Sunday. Sunday? All right, the 10th of this month, there'll be a skating party at Jim Frank's. It's over on Hamlin Road, towards Route 7. And we look forward to having everybody out for that. I think it'll be it's a family affair, so I think everybody will really enjoy it.
Thank you, Ralph. By the way, Merritt mentioned that afterwards, if any of you are interested in buying some eggs, we have those available. Now, as your program chairman also this morning, I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. At first, I thought I would just say a few very simple things, but I started to read the notes that Bob gave me here, and I thought, my gosh, some things here I didn't realize. I think maybe I'll just read them to you. I've had the honor, I would say, of since 1951 of working with his brother in a political way in television, and has never, as up to this moment, had the opportunity to talk with Mr. Lodge. Let me just mention a few of these things. He was graduated from Harvard in 25. He married an actress, Frances Braghiotti, in 1920. Francesca. Well, we're going to hear more about proper pronunciations coming up here. And Spain, too. He went to Harvard Law School, and he worked on motion picture contracts as a lawyer. This is one part I wasn't quite clear in my own mind. He went to Hollywood in 32 in the legal department. I knew that, of course, that he had film tests and then appeared in a number of motion pictures. I believe opposite Marlene Dietrich, a number of the other famous actresses. So, boy, this man is really versatile. He entered politics, or as a congressman in 47 in the 4th District. Now, I think we all recognize, I think that rings a bell quickly. But today, his latest honor has been as U.S. Ambassador, of course, to Spain. And we are hopeful today that we would get an insight as part of our series on world issues in what the ambassador does in a country, the reflections, of course, in this case, we'd like to hear about Spain, the practical areas that an ambassador works within, and, of course, his hopes. So it's with a great deal of honor, Ambassador John Lodge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ballou, Mr. Vice President, gentlemen. I'm very grateful to you for this invitation, because, quite frankly, I don't usually get up as early as this. And the result is that
If I hadn't got up this early this morning, I would have missed the great beauty of our Connecticut landscape on an early Sunday morning after a snowfall. I must say it is very good for the soul and very heartwarming to have made the trip that I made from nearby Westport this morning and note how lovely and peaceful our countryside is. It also stands in rather sharp contrast to the state of the world, and that is, after all, something to which we must all address ourselves. I came across a quotation the other day, which I'm sure that you younger men will recognize right away. I confess that I did not recognize it right away. Indeed, I had to be told where it was from. It's very short, and I'll read it. And any of you boys who know what it comes from, just say so. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, it was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. No, not Point, the ancient Maryland by Coleridge. No, this is part of the magnificent introduction which Charles Dickens gave to his immortal classic, A Tale of Two Cities, dealing with the year 1775, just prior to the outbreak of the American Revolution and just prior to, not very long prior to the outbreak of the French Revolution. Isn't that true of us today? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Here we are, a man with his vast accumulation of knowledge, with his remarkable scientific discoveries, and yet man faced with Armageddon, with self-destruction, with annihilation. And I think it underscores something else. We're apt to think that the day we live in is so unique that we must reconsider all our values, that even the eternal verities must be held up for re-examination and attack. I remember when Norman Cousins wrote his book, Modern Man is Obsolete. And he lives in Connecticut. I said to him, Norman, I don't agree with you. I think the challenge is exactly the same, but it simply has been given a terrible urgency by the weapons of destruction which we have fashioned. I think that the kind of communion service that we attended this morning, which reminds us all of how eternal these verities are, is just as useful today as it ever has been. And so I don't think that we ought to allow ourselves to be stampeded away from these precepts and concepts which have guided us in this country ever since we started. They are more valid than ever. And certainly we do live in a very difficult and dangerous world. Certainly one of the greatest weapons that we have is, insofar as we have it, is unity. I don't mean unanimity. We don't look for unanimity in the United States. We don't look for it in our political parties. We don't look for it at home. At least I don't get it at home. Because I only have daughters. I learned to say yes a long time ago. But we do like to think that we have an essential unity. And within the framework of the United Nations, various alliances have been formed with the idea of creating a certain unity, a certain solidarity, a certain strength. One of these alliances, of course, is the NATO alliance, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Spain is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, although Spain is an Atlantic nation. And the reason Spain is not a member is principally because Norway objects. We live in a strange world. The Norwegians are fine people. They have 3 million people. They have a common frontier with the Russians, and of course they are not very active members of NATO. The Spaniards have 30 million people. And they are extremely active outside of NATO. We have large bases there. But the Norwegians don't like the Spanish form of government. And the whole thing is tied up with the labor socialist form of government that they have in Norway. I remember having an interesting talk with the Norwegian minister in Madrid when I first got there. I said, I must say that I do regret that Norway takes this attitude, because all it takes is one blackball in NATO to keep a nation out. Well, he said, we don't like the form of government the Spaniards have. I said, well, frankly, I wouldn't want in my country to have the form of government that you have, which is a combination of a monarchy plus a labor socialist regime. I personally would not favor that in the United States. I would struggle very hard against it. But I said that doesn't mean that we cannot have friendly and fruitful relations with you. And I think that if we're going to decide that we can pass judgment on the form of government that every nation has, we're going to deprive ourselves of a great deal of useful assistance. And the fact is that there are fewer democracies in the world today than there were at the end of the war to make the world safe for democracy. And while this may be a pity, it is nonetheless a relentless fact. And we would do well to first to try to form the kind of unity which can save the world. And then after we have won through against the threat of communist conquest, communist aggression, then these nations will have an opportunity, the new nations especially, to evolve toward the exciting responsibilities of freedom, traded and taken over by the communist marauders. Now Spain, curiously enough, though Spain and Portugal are the closest European nations to us, and yet in many respects I think Spain seems very remote. It certainly did to me, and I think that's true of most Americans. I have spent a good deal of time in France, England, and Italy, and Belgium. I didn't know Spain well when I came there. And there's an interesting book written by a an interesting book written by a Spanish writer by the name of Jose Maria Gironella, and it's called The Cypresses Believe in God. It deals with the Spanish Civil War. It is brilliantly written. And this is what he says. He says, Spain is an unknown country. Experience proves that it is hard to view my country impartially. Even writers of high order succumb to the temptation to adulterate the truth, to treat our customs and our psychology as though everything about them were of a piece, of a single color. Legends and labels pile up. Black Spain, inquisitorial Spain, beautiful Spain, tragic Spain, folkloric Spain, unhappy Spain, a projection of Africa into the map of Europe. That's the end of the quotation. Spain has been misunderstood and misrepresented in our country many times over. You know how we don't like it when people think of us as a nation of millionaires, gangsters, rock and rollers, people who chew gum, drink Coca-Cola, and have no cultural life and no spiritual life. We rather resent that because we know that is not the most important side of America. Well, the Spaniards are rather surprised when they find that the average American thinks of Spain as a land of bullfights, Spanish senoritas, flamenco dances, and the poor people. And let's say conquistadores. All these rather superficial views that have been formed as a result of our motion pictures and the kind of propaganda that we're subjected to and have been over the years. Now, a realization which I have found helpful in understanding Spain and its political tradition is that this land, located on the periphery of Europe and associated for over several hundred years with North African peoples, never went through or was influenced only very slightly by two of the philosophical experiences which are fundamental to the origin of our country and our way of thinking. And I refer to the profound changes in thought which grew out of 18th century French rationalism and then the French Revolution. The Pyrenees, which are still a formidable barrier in many ways, were then an almost impenetrable barrier. And only faint ripples from the French Revolution got down as far as Spain. Similarly, the impact of the 19th century Industrial Revolution upon Spain's economic and social fabric was not nearly so far-reaching as in other countries of Western Europe, in Great Britain or in the United States. And then Spain was never exposed to the Protestant Reformation, which was surely one of the great upheavals of what you might loosely refer to as modern times. Spain was the source, the center, the motive power of the Counter-Reformation. I've always thought that it was rather unconstructive to take an attitude of personal resentment against historical forces. I sat next to a very charming lady yesterday at a meal, and she said, "My husband and I have decided to visit Spain. We had decided we would never visit Spain as long as they had a dictatorship because we don't like dictatorships." Well, she's a very attractive lady, this lady. I said, "Dear lady, that rather limits the number of countries you can visit. There is no democracy in Africa, anyway. In all honesty, a real, substantive, working democracy. Well, in South America, if you want to stretch a point, you could say Uruguay, Costa Rica, at the moment, Chile, although that situation is beginning to spoil. Argentina doesn't look like a very healthy democracy to me, neither does Brazil. So what do? Say, oh no, you're impure, we won't deal with you? And I said to this lady, I said, you know, they have no juvenile delinquency in Spain. Now, supposing the Spaniards were to send over a group of people here and say, we're going to teach you Americans how to live without juvenile delinquency, how to live without hoodlums in the street who mug people and rob people, because we don't have that in Spain. We would resent it, wouldn't we? Now, there's a perfectly good, objective, historical explanation as to why the Spaniards do not have juvenile delinquency and why we do. And there's a perfectly good, objective, historical explanation as to why the Spaniards do not have democracy and we do. And I think it is much more constructive and useful to try to understand these things. Let us not try to reform the world in our own image. We have said that we're not trying to reform our enemies. Well, then let's not try to reform our friends. They don't like it. Spain, never having until recently been exposed to the Industrial Revolution, has not yet got the problems of urbanization and industrialization such as we have. And the Spaniards are held together very tightly by the family, by their religion. And the result is that when some Americans say with some impatience, oh, Spain is 30 or 40 years behindhand, yes, And let me say that when you go down there, you find some very attractive things which have been crushed in the path of progress in other places. The fact that there is change doesn't mean there's always progress. You cannot have progress without change, but you can have change without progress. And some of these values look mighty attractive when you live in that country. Now, it should also be remembered that Spain, almost all of Spain, was occupied for almost 8 centuries by the Moors, the Arabs, with results which persist to the present day. For instance, I have several Jewish friends who say to me, I won't go to Spain because, I said, why? Oh, they're anti-Semitic. Well, of course, that isn't true. There's far less anti-Semitism, I'm being very frank. There's far less anti-Semitism in Spain than there is in the United States. And the reasons are perfectly simple, because the Spaniards are quite a mixture of bloods. There's a heavy Semitic strain, and of course the Arabs are a Semitic people. And there's a lot of Arab blood in Spain. And although they did have a pogrom, and certainly it was unfortunate and sad and stupid to have this pogrom, they're not the only country that's indulged in this, and it is rather futile at this point, some 400 years later, to make that the basis for an attitude, because right now there are synagogues in Madrid, and there is far less anti-Semitism than there is anti-Protestantism. And I'm a Protestant, I'm an Episcopalian, I was ambassador to Spain for 6 years, and I never suffered from it in any way at all. Because it isn't among the people. There are certain elements in the hierarchy that might feel that way. I am convinced that had I been a Roman Catholic, I could not have done a better job than being an Episcopalian. We're now given these physical factors and the historic tradition of Spain. There are many valid reasons why Spain has developed along economic, social, and political lines, which are in many respects quite different from those we have followed in the United States. But this doesn't mean that we can't work closely together in a fruitful relationship founded on mutual respect and on the larger concept of the defense of the Western world against the onslaught of communist imperialism. Of course, from a strategical point of view and also politically and psychologically, Spain stands at a kind of a crossroads of some of the world's most vital areas and turbulent currents. The Iberian Peninsula faces Africa to the south and Europe to the north. The Atlantic Ocean lies on its northwestern shores and the Mediterranean to the east. It has strong linguistic and religious ties with the Hispanic world overseas, sort of the mother country of all of South America except Brazil. It is perhaps better able to understand the Arab approach to life than any other country. And finally, Spain has now strong bonds of defensive agreements with the United States. I might say that the visit of President Eisenhower to Madrid in December '59 was an event of outstanding significance in the evolution of Spanish-U.S. affairs, and I think in the evolution of modern Spain. It made them feel that they belonged. I remember once after a lecture that I delivered on Spain, one person during the question period said to me, well, now you must admit that during the Spanish Civil War, Franco received help from Hitler and Mussolini. I said, that's right. And during World War II, Roosevelt received help from Stalin. In other words, this is a dangerous approach to a problem. Hitler and Mussolini are not the enemies now. The enemy is Soviet Russia, they have so stated. Franco fought Soviet Russia, Franco and his people. So let's not resent it too much, because he was the first to combat communism successfully, as they did in Spain. There is absolutely no question that had Franco and his forces lost the Spanish Civil War, Spain would have been communist. I know that Mr. Herbert Matthews does not think so. But Mr. Herbert Matthews is wrong about this, as he was wrong about Cuba. And if Spain had gone communist before World War II, I venture to say that Italy and France would probably be communist today. Because the communist parties in Italy and France are the largest in the world. There is no, except for Russia. But in the satellite countries, there is no communist party as large as the party in Italy, for instance. And so I think it is useful in public affairs to think in terms of constructive alternatives. The Spaniards had a recent experience with what they call a republic. It turned out to be one of the most tragic events of their turbulent and rather somber history. They estimate that they had 1 million dead out of 28 million people in a 3-year civil war. We had, I think, 600,000 dead out of about 28 million people during our civil war 100 years ago. But almost all our dead were in uniform. Whereas in Spain, they took out and shot in the city of Madrid alone 80,000 people. Children, women, old people, they just took them out of their houses. Anybody who was well-to-do was just taken out and shot, or put into prison for a while and then shot. They've been through this thing. Now, of course, there's a whole new generation that has grown up, of young people born since the end of the Civil War. And a war which you don't remember, just as I don't remember the Spanish-American War because I wasn't alive then, somehow doesn't have the same effect on you as the war you do remember. And I suppose is one of the reasons how we continue to have wars, as a matter of human experience. But we shouldn't expect the Spaniards to behave just the way we do. Actually, we shouldn't want them to. It would be an awfully dull world if it was all exactly like the USA, much as we love our country. We don't want the whole world to be like Broadway and 42nd Street. In any event, they're not going to behave just the way we do. And so one of the ideas with which I, as an amateur diplomat, approached my job was, and I found it quite useful, that I was not there to try to lecture to them or to reform them, but to try to understand them. And I found, I think that may I say that I think relations between nations are in a way like the relations between a man and a woman. A man tries to understand a woman. Most of us don't succeed very well. But we spend a lifetime trying. And we love the woman. We don't try to change her. If we do, we don't succeed. I don't suppose there's ever been a case where a man has succeeded. And we just make the situation rather unhappy. Well, now I think the same thing is true between nations. I might say that the Spanish people are really lovable people. They're people of great dignity. They're people of enormous courage. And this is perhaps one of the main reasons why they're not temperamentally as well suited to our home government as we are. To us, I'm sure the Vice President will agree with this, most of the challenges in public life are challenges to a man's judgment. And there are some that are challenges to his courage. Well, the Spaniard is temperamentally so adjusted that he regards most of life's challenges as a challenge to his courage. And compromise becomes surrender. Now, there are certain exceptional ones who have evolved beyond that. But even my most liberal Spanish friends say to me, of course, parliamentary democracy cannot work here. They've tried it. And frankly, I think the only place where it's really worked well has been in England. They've abandoned it in France after trying it over a number of years. In Italy, it's working very poorly right now. I don't believe it would work in the United States, and I'm glad we haven't got it in the United States, although theoretically it's a more democratic form of government than our own. And I don't think it would work in Spain. It hasn't worked in Spain. So what form of government will take over after the disappearance of General Franco? And I'm often asked the question, what happens after Franco? Well, of course, I'm not much of a prophet, and I think it's very dangerous to try to prophesy. Spain is a monarchy now, a monarchy without a king. General Franco is chief of state, jefe del Estado. He's kind of a regent of Spain, and he's chief of government. He's fond of pointing out, I might say, that in the United States the president is very powerful because he is both the chief of government and the chief of state. And this is not true of most other countries. So, for instance, when General Eisenhower went to Geneva in 1955, he was the only chief of state who was present, except for the president of Switzerland. All the others were simply chiefs of government. And this is a distinction which is sometimes forgotten in this country, but it is an important distinction. And if something were to happen to General Franco tomorrow, what would happen in Spain would be this. And since last July, they have a vice president, so-called, or a vice premier, General Munoz Grandes, who used to be the minister of the army and then the chief of the high general staff. He's a highly respected soldier, and he would take over. He's also a member of the council of the realm, and that's composed of three people: the Cardinal Primate of Spain, Cardinal Play Daniel, who's a very old gentleman now, and the head of the Cortes, which is the Spanish Assembly. And these three will get together and call a meeting of the Council of, this is the Council of Regents, they call a meeting of the Council of the Realm and of the Cabinet. And then they would decide, presumably, what claimants to the throne would be brought back. There were 5 claimants to the throne of Spain. Now, this isn't because the idea of a monarchy is so tremendously popular in Spain, or so tremendously unpopular either. I don't think there's a great deal of support for the restoration of an active monarchy. And there isn't a great deal of opposition either. It would, however, I think, be a convenient way to bridge this gap without trouble. Because Spain is a country which can suddenly erupt like Latin American countries. And if we understood the Spaniards better, we would understand the South Americans better than we do. Knowing Spain a bit, I venture to say that one of the mistakes that we have made in South America, no matter which party has held the presidency, is that we don't realize that what the South American really wants is to be treated as a brother, as a co-equal. He wants us to put our arms around him and say, pal, you and I are in this thing together on a co-equal basis. He prefers that to having some State Department fellow go down there and sign a check for $100 million. The Spaniards are like that. They are very sensitive to the personal friendly approach. And when the Spaniard is your friend, he is really your friend. And he loves being your friend when everything is going against you. Then he really proves how friendly he is. A little over 9 years ago, in September '53, following a year and a half of exploratory study and negotiation, which began with the trip of Admiral Forrest Sherman, late Admiral Forrest Sherman, to Madrid in 1951, our government and the government of Spain signed 3 agreements. And the first of these had to do with the construction and establishment in Spain for the joint defensive use of our 2 countries of 5 military bases, one of them Navy, a pipeline 485 miles long, and other military facilities. The second agreement called for American military aid. The third and last agreement provided for defense support, that is, economic assistance for Spain in strengthening those sectors of her economy, key industries, communications, transportation system, agriculture, which are related to the effective functioning of the new complex of bases. Now, all these major facilities are now virtually complete and virtually 100% operational, and we continue to receive excellent cooperation from our Spanish friends with respect to these operations. Now, on the surface, you might think that the signing of these agreements was an obvious act of self-interest on the part of both countries, but its achievement was a question of much greater complexity and more lasting significance than any simple physical arrangement. The days when we affirmed our own neutrality are not so long past as to have erased the memory of the motives and the reactions which led us to try to avoid what we then considered dangerous foreign entanglements. Well, a similar desire to avoid foreign entanglements gripped the Spanish people and its government well through the end of World War II. It just happens that Spanish neutrality favored our side. I've heard some people express resentment against General Franco and his government because of his neutrality. May I say that the most dependable opinion that I've gotten from thoughtful people is that his neutrality was the best thing that he could do. If he had, obviously, if he had come out against us on the side of the Germans, the Italians, as he was under constant pressure to do, that would have been very bad for us. It would have made the landing in North Africa extremely difficult, perhaps impossible. The torch operation in November of '42, and the correspondence between President Franklin Roosevelt and General Franco reveals this. It's a tremendously interesting correspondence. It shows, I'm glad to say, how realistic Franklin Roosevelt was about this question. Now, if he'd come out on our side, Germany would have moved right in and occupied the whole of Spain. It might have cost them a little trouble, because the Spaniards are very good at guerrilla fighting, but Spain had been through a very tough civil war. Many of her cities were in ruins. And there's a famous story of Franco's meeting with Hitler in a railroad carriage in December 1940 at Hendaye, which is just across the border from Irun, up in the Basque country. And Irun was completely leveled during the Spanish Civil War. There wasn't one house standing. It's quite a large city now. And Hitler had 12 divisions on the Pyrenees, Panzer divisions. He'd gone right through France. Those of you who remember back to December 1940. And there was a lot of defeatism all over the world about this thing. There was defeatism right in the United States. So Franco went up to talk to Hitler in his private railroad carriage. And Hitler talked to him for about 5 hours. Franco is one of the few public men I know of who was capable of remaining silent for 5 hours and listening to somebody else talk. I'm sure the Vice President will agree with me that is rather a unique attribute in a public man. And he also is, he's very calm. He's not the American's idea of a Spaniard at all. He's extremely composed. He's a soldier, but he's extremely composed. Finally, at the end of the 5 hours, Hitler said, I have this story from a man who was there, who was the interpreter between Hitler and Franco on that occasion. He happened to be the interpreter for me when I didn't speak Spanish and presented my credentials to General Franco in March of 1955. So he was there. He knows this story. And finally, at the end of 5 hours, Hitler, who was a man of violent temper, took a chair and he smashed it down on the floor of the railroad carriage and turned to General Franco in a rage and said, General Franco, the war is over. You'd better climb on board now and fast, or worse that fast. With that, General Franco, who had done nothing but listen for 5 hours, said, no, Mr. Hitler, I don't think so. I don't think the war is quite begun yet. well, whether it's that he has an excellent suggestion, I don't know. I sometimes think that some of our law cases are well decided if the judge has a good suggestion. I think General Franco must have a very good suggestion, because that is the remark of a man who really is very steady on his feet. To be able to say in December 1940, with Hitler right down on the Pyrenees, and riding a railroad carriage right across the border from your country, and your country 1/3 in ruins and 1 million dead, to be able to say, no, I don't think the war is quite begun yet, is an interesting observation. And it took a great deal of, perspicacity to say that. In any event, Hitler had tried to bribe him with Gibraltar, which is something that the Spaniards want very badly. And the neutrality, which obviously Spanish neutrality was thinking of Spanish interests. There's nothing wrong with that. We think of our interests too. But it did actually serve our cause much more than any participation could have. And so, although under considerable pressure from Hitler to join the Axis during the Second World War, he adhered to a policy of neutrality. Now, aside from a defensive alliance made with our next-door neighbor Portugal in '39, dictated by the obvious geographical necessity of defending the Iberian Peninsula, the agreements of 1953 with the United States were the first major foreign military accords entered into by Spain in modern history. And the reason is, of course, that despite its isolation, Spain understood the true nature of the communist danger and the urgent need to be strong and ready to meet its challenge. The other two principal directions in which Spain has sought to strengthen her international ties have been the Hispanic one, implemented through the fostering of her historical, cultural, and religious ties with the sister republics of Central and South America, and for the Arab world through an active policy of rapprochement with the Muslim countries, using as a bridge its favorable relationships with the Moroccan peoples of North Africa. These relationships have been subjected to a certain number of strains recently. There's been a great deal of communist infiltration. The Red Chinese have been establishing consulates in North Africa. So perhaps the idea that some of our compatriots have about all these Boston Tea Parties taking place in North Africa will suffer some very great disillusionment. There is an enormous communist infiltration. Of course, it's already taking place in Algeria, and it's taking place in Morocco. Now, of course, gradually other Western nations, certain other ones, as they too became convinced of the real danger of Russian communist imperialism, became more understanding and appreciative of Spain's value in the defense of the West. And so in 1950, the United Nations, by resolution, lifted the ostracism it voted against Spain in '46 in the Social Council. And so it was that from the status of almost an international pariah under the United Nations condemnation at the close of World War II, 1946, Spain today has a defense agreement with the United States, has concluded a concordat with the Vatican, is a member of the United Nations, and in July of '59 became a full-fledged member of the OEC, which is now the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Europe. Spain is a member now of the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the GATT organization, the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade. Spain received no aid under the Marshall Plan. Our economic aid to Spain has been of several types. I don't want to take up too much of your time with that, but the economy of Spain is, I have a tendency to talk too long on this subject, is now doing extremely well. They went in for an economic stabilization plan back in July of '59. And from a minus position, they came about a year ago to a position where they have over $1 billion gold reserves, and hard currency. Their gold is heavily backed, and they have achieved stability of theta at 60. They've been controlling the price rise. They brought inflation under control, and they did this with the help of the International Monetary Fund and the OEC. And I was ambassador to Spain at that time, and we had a kind of a package deal. It involved a total sum of about $425 million. It was amazing to Americans, I know, that with such a relatively small sum, you could do so much good in a country of 30 million people. But the Spanish economy is marginal. Some years our entire aid program would virtually be wiped out by a flood or a freeze. And this program has had a splendid effect. Now, it took a good deal of courage to grab a hold of this. President Kubitschek of Brazil refused it. One of the main advantages that it had from my point of view is that I suppose you could say that one of the embarrassing things that an ambassador has to do is sometimes to appear as though he's intervening in the internal affairs of a foreign country by telling a country what we think they ought to do about their economy. But when you're giving economic aid, you naturally feel that you not only have a right but an obligation to the American taxpayers, the American electorate, to address yourself to this problem. You do it as tactfully as you can, naturally. Well, now in this case, we pushed to have Spain join the IMF. We thought they could, and they did, finally, under pressure, and were accepted, and the result was that the IMF, International Monetary Fund, sent a kind of a clinic over to Spain. And the head of it was a Frenchman. It wasn't the U.S. government. And these men had talks with the Spanish members of the Spanish government, the Minister of Commerce, the Minister of Industry, the Minister of Hacienda, which is Finance, Treasury, and so on, Foreign Affairs. And they talked to them the same way your doctor might talk to you, you know. When your doctor says, well, now look, John, I mean, let's face it, you've been smoking too much, you better cut that out. And drinking too much, you better go to bed earlier. And all this, well, the medicine is not very pleasant, but there it is.
I don't know if much of it is readable. We got this tape at a antique store in Sebastian, Florida, and it had, those sounds. I heard Vice President, and since the tape says 62, I'm thinking it might be Lyndon B. Johnson or LBJ for short, but I'm not sure. I'm going to show you guys the tape. It's just a standard Scotch. I'm recording this video in 720p, so it's not that great. Yeah. But, yeah, I thought this tape would be interesting. We're going to upload a part 2 in a little bit, so, yep, that should be it for now.